welcome to this very special Indianomics. Reserve Bank's flexible inflation targeting rule requires that every 5 years, the government shall, in consultation with the Reserve Bank, set the inflation target for the Monetary Policy Committee. The target of 4% CPI plus or minus 2% was set back in 2016 for 5 years till 2021. In March 2021, the government reviewed and retained the same target, the same range from 2021 to 26. Now, ahead of the review in 2026, the second review, the Reserve Bank has released a discussion paper asking members of the public to discuss and give feedback on the following 4 questions. 1, whether the MPC should target headline or core inflation, that is inflation minus food and fuel. 2, whether the 4% CPI target continues to remain the right target or whether it should be changed. 3, should the range of plus or minus 2% be narrowed, widened or done away with? 4, should the inflation target be removed and only the range be retained? Those are the 4 questions, and joining me to review the performance of India's inflation targeting regime and to answer these 4 questions are Sajjid Chinoy, Head of Asia Economic Research at JPMorgan, also one of the original members of the Urjit Patel Committee which recommended flexible inflation targeting. So, more questions to him. And Niranjan Rajadhyaksha, the Executive Director of Artha Global, a think tank and research organization, and formerly Executive Editor of Mint newspaper. He's everyone's best consultant for economics. Niranjan, Sajjid, thank you very much for joining me. Well, first up, let's assess. Is it a success? Last 10 years, after all, we did have 4-5 years during COVID. I think 4-5 quarters in COVID when we were above even 6%.
Right. So, Latha, we have 3 criteria, I think, that I use to judge how this is done. The first is, there are always going to be exogenous shocks. So looking at absolute levels of inflation can be misleading. Look at how India has performed compared to the rest of the world. And that inflation differential with the rest of the world has narrowed meaningfully over the last decade. So, A, we have relatively outperformed, number 1. For me, perhaps the biggest test here is the whole idea of a nominal anchor, an inflation target, is to serve as a coordinating mechanism for the economy to anchor inflation expectations around the target. An easy way to test that is to say, does headline inflation converge to core or does core converge to headline? And what you see is before inflation targeting came into practice in India, the data reveals us clearly, core used to converge to headline. That's a fancy way of saying inflation expectations were not anchored. For the last decade, what do we see? After the FIT regime, headline inflation consistently converges to core once shocks dissipate. So that's another way of showing that the purpose of this to anchor inflation expectations has been achieved. You have less spillover of shocks to food and fuel spilling over into core inflation. And the last is just look at RBI's inflation expectations data. There are shocks that we've all been through this poly-crisis period, but expectations are more anchored. So by each of the 3 criteria, how we've done compared to the rest of the world, whether headline converges to core, and that's changed after inflation target came in, and how measured inflation expectations are, I think by all accounts, it's worked very well.
Okay, well, just for the data that RBI put in the discussion paper, average CPI since the 2016 adoption up till 21, up till the COVID actually, was 4.9%. Right. And average CPI from 2013 to 16, that is the new CPI series, was 6.8. So, their data is that statistically, at least, it has worked. But the CEA had opposed it, saying that in the first 5 years, anyway, food inflation everywhere was benign. In the next 3-4 years, food inflation was high and we didn't control. So that there is a counter-argument. But Niranjan, you want to add success or failure?
No, I usually end up agreeing with most of what Sajjid says. So I completely agree with him, that...
the deviation from global...
I think that India is no longer an outlier. Say 10 years ago, if you looked at the world, it was battling deflation. Our inflation was pushing near double digits. Then, if you forget, you may say that the advanced economies are a different dynamic. But if you look at China, if you look at even peer economies of Asia, India was like 3, 4, 5 percentage points higher than the average. So I agree with Sajjid. And I think the more important point is what he just mentioned about the dynamics between core and inflation and headline inflation, that if headline inflation is eventually converging to core whenever there is a temporary differential, it means that in a way people trust, he said inflation expectations, I would say people trust the Reserve Bank of India to keep inflation on target or close to target. So, yeah, I agree with Sajjid that it's done quite well. There are, there'll always be debates about how the mandate is interpreted, etc. But net, I think it's worked for us.
Yeah. No, I think the missing chair here is the CEA. If I can convince him, I should get him. But he has very good arguments why the the framework itself is not appropriate even for developed countries. But that is not the mandate given by RBI. RBI has accepted flexible inflation. They are only asking the members of the public to argue within that.
Yeah.
The target is not being questioned at all. I mean, the framework is not being questioned.
Yeah, and Latha, I think the issue is how do you interpret the target? So if you look at not the monetary, the Reserve Bank, the amended Reserve Bank Act, but even the monetary policy agreement, it's not that growth is completely out of the equation, So there is a trade-off which the RBI has to. But in normal times, inflation management should be the, the standard, the main focus. And secondly, RBI is a full-service central bank, so it has to, in some way intervene in the foreign exchange market. It has financial stability, financial development, tools. I think the key thing is you should ask yourself that the RBI or the MPC has control over the repo rate. How are interest rates going to be matched to the inflation rate? It doesn't mean that RBI should do nothing but inflation control.
Okay. No, that's a fair question. We'll just come to that in a bit. But let me take the first question that the Reserve Bank has put on our plate. Core or headline? Now, I think there is a very legit argument that food is not controllable by the Reserve Bank. And, I counted from August of 2023 to December of 2024, 18 months, inflation was well above 6. In fact, it was between 8 and 11%. Yeah. But it did impact core. And RBI could do precious little about it. The argument is that by looking at it, you kept the system tight. Is that therefore...
So it is true that the
food
inflation and fuel inflation
core
is, they're more susceptible to exogenous shocks, whether it's climate shocks, international geopolitics, etc. So accepted. But eventually, if your about 50% of your basket is fuel and food, you really can't have an inflation targeting framework and say that I'm only going to target half the CPI. The second is revealed preference. When the Ujit Patel committee was discussing this, and I remember, Sajjid and I had a chat about it way back then. I don't know if he remembers. Thailand was one of the only economies in Asia which actually was targeting core. Thailand...
Uganda is also.
Yes. So now in this RBI paper, I think only Uganda is the... So I think there is, there is some logic, even other central banks, if you see the record, they are looking at headline inflation as their main target.
Yes, 48 countries.
Because Latha, it comes down to ultimately how does the framework work? And a key part, as I said, is to serve as a coordinating mechanism. See, inflation is both a function of slack, but also expectations. Therefore, it becomes so self-fulfilling. And so if this is meant to be a coordinating mechanism, you can't have an inflation target for a central bank that is very divorced from the lived experience of individuals. If 40-45% of your consumption is going to be food, and hopefully that will come down over time, but if it's going to be 40% of food, and that's what impacts your inflation expectations, then you can't have a central bank that's looking at another measure independent of that. The other quick point to make is if you get sustained shocks to food, they may, in a tight labor market, translate into wages, right? So by ignoring the food part and only focusing on cost, sometimes it's too late. The genie has left the bottle by the time headline, the food shock goes into core.
Yeah, I still have sympathy for the idea that central banks can't control food. And also in those 18 months that I just spoke about, we did not see it come over. This feeling that, food is expensive and therefore I need higher wages was not the trend observed. So the charge that by looking at food, the Reserve Bank probably tends to keep the economy tight remains. And the counterfactual can never be proved. Would the economy have grown more if they had not kept it tight? We don't know.
That's when the the flexible inflation targeting matters. Why do you have a 200 basis point band around it? When we debated that 12 years ago, it was precisely because of this.
Okay.
That there are occasions in which there is a shock to food, which is 40%. And if core is much lower than that, the central bank has the latitude to keep inflation about. We saw that in the pandemic. In the pandemic, inflation was consistently above 4%, but the RBI did not respond to that given the contextual circumstances.
Fair point.
This goes back to the point I was trying to make, that a lot also then depends on how the RBI interprets its mandate, because there are sometimes very, very good reasons to look through temporary shocks to food, or, we've seen like vegetables often, spark off a bout of high inflation. So a lot depends on how the RBI interprets its mandate. I think there is enough, if there are no observable second-order effects, either in terms of firm markups or in terms of higher wage demands, which will then flow into a second round of price hikes, I think the central bank is within its mandate to look through a temporary period of high inflation.
Yes, and I think they've communicated it beautifully at the times when they looked through.
And we've been through 3 years of this in the pandemic. That's my point.
Just one more before I finish this, and I want to go to the point of whether it should be 4 or 5 or 3, whether it should change. That's the more important argument for me. Should we tweak the sentence in some way to give importance to core? I mean, the target is still headline inflation at 5 or at 4 or whatever, but core gets an emphasis. Should we accept that governments can't control food? Is there a need to tweak?
See, there are different measures of inflation, right? So we have a WPI index, you have a CPI index, you have core inflation, you have a GDP deflator. Now, as and when, somebody says that you should look at GDP deflator, sometimes you say an average of WPI per CPI. The question is, how do economic agents, what do they respond to? What does the man on the street respond to? That person, he or she is not responding to your
WPI.
core inflation or your WPI or GDP deflator. This is for us to, discuss in television studios. But I think the average person, what hits the family budget is the entire headline, the entire CPI. And that can change behavior if it leads to unanchored inflation expectations.
10 seconds, Latha. If you burden the RBI, I think the first thing we agreed on, Niranjan, 10 years ago when we met, or 15 years ago, was the Tinbergen principle. Yeah. You must have as many instruments as you have objectives. If you were to have focus on headline, focus on core, focus on growth, you're diluting the whole idea of inflation target. If you give the RBI...
change the sentence at all.
It's going to get so muddled that nobody's going to know what the RBI is eventually after. And I go back to the beginning. What is the purpose of this? This purpose is to anchor expectations. If you have so many objectives, no one knows what you're after, how can you anchor expectations around anything?
Actually, Mishkin, the economist, is quoted, and he's saying that central banks may emphasize headline as target, but be guided more by core while deciding.
That's in advanced economies where core is typically 70 to 80% of your basket.
And see, even the US Fed, they sometimes look at PF, private final consumption expenditure deflator. These are inputs into the decision-making process. The target is...
So don't explicitly change it, but it will...
So, again, it depends on how you interpret your mandate.
Monetary policy is an art, not a science. And I think the framework is meant to provide this combination of stability...
And we have to take the next question quickly. 5% or 4%. Should we stick with 4%?
Yeah. So, the way I look at it is this way. The 4% came out of very sophisticated statistical, including by the Urjit Patel committee, but even other economists, that this is the sort of inflation level which maximizes output on a sustained basis. Now, the way I look at it also is that 10 years ago, the advanced economies, they were targeting 2% inflation. Normally, because of what is called the Balassa-Samuelson effect, another 2% is added to an emerging market. So in a way, the anchor of that, is the 2% which the...
Developed economy.
And then you add 2%. So now, if you are saying that inflation has moved up over the past, especially now...
Globally, yeah.
Is there a case to push it up to 5%? Maybe. But the reason I would still argue against it is that it opens a Pandora's box. Because once you start fidgeting with the inflation target, you can create confusion, So I personally feel that there could be a technical argument for a 5% inflation rate, but then you basically said every 5 years you will have something else, some different target. And when the idea is that over a medium term you want to stabilize expectations. So I think that keeping this anchor makes sense.
Okay, but I've not completed this argument. I have to take a commercial break. We'll come back and continue this argument of whether inflation target should be changed from 4 to 5 or to something less. All those arguments coming. Bazaar viewers, you will get into Chartbusters after the break, but the entire show will be played after market hours.